talked about anaerobic respiration, but now we're going to interest ourselves even better in more in how does it actually take place. Now, to remind ourselves, anaerobic respiration comes from two words, that is an and aeros, actually three. Remember, in biology it has compound words, a number of them. Big for bios, aeros for air, and an for without. So this is respiration without air. So the breakdown of food to release energy but without use of oxygen. Well, some organisms actually do not use oxygen even if it's available. So all their life they carry out anaerobic respiration. However, organisms like you and I and animals that we see walking basically depend on aerobic respiration for them to be able to get the energy they need to do their different life processes. Well, plants and animals, anaerobic respiration takes place for the most part due to absence of oxygen. Due to absence of oxygen. That means that probably the respiratory system cannot provide as much oxygen as required by the body at that time. Take an example of during vigorous exercise. At that time, your muscles contract and relax really fast and they need oxygen so fast that your circulatory system and your respiratory system cannot provide it as fast. So, muscles resort to anaerobic respiration. And now that leads to production of a substance referred to as lactic animals. Lactic acid is produced. Lactic acid is produced. How about in plants? In plants, ethanol is produced. Something applies to fungi like yeast. They produce ethanol when they carry out anaerobic respiration. In this case, water is not produced, but carbon dioxide and either lactic acid or ethanol plus a little energy. Actually, anaerobic respiration produces very little energy. Much less energy is produced during anaerobic respiration because it is still locked up within these components, as to say lactic acid and ethanol. And now let us look at the equation that takes place when glucose is burnt down to produce ethanol and carbon dioxide in plants and yeast. This is the equation. This is the structure of the formula of glucose being burnt down to form ethanol. Ethanol is CH5, C2H5OH, carbon dioxide, and a little energy. So we can balance it by putting a 2 here and a 2 here, so that the left hand side of our equation balances with the right hand side. Anaerobic respiration can provide you a little energy to go a little further when doing a strenuous exercise, say lifting weights, maybe running, but there comes a time when your muscles cannot take it on anymore. Why is that so? Because anaerobic respiration cannot give as much energy as they require, and so you get muscle fatigue, and the best thing you can do for your life at that moment is fall somewhere. And now that leads us to an important part which we refer to as debt. What is oxygen debt? It has oxygen and a debt. Debts have to be paid. So, oxygen debt the amount of oxygen required to break down the lactic acid that accumulates during a strenuous exercise. By the time you fall down and you can't take it anymore, or you can't carry those weights anymore, it's because of the so much lactic acid that has accumulated within your muscles, and therefore as you sit down you just can't help it but breathe in very deeply and very fast. Now that enables to bring in as much oxygen to your cells as possible so that the lactic acid is broken down as fast as possible, because it's not good for your cells. So as you breathe in deeply and fast, you're paying the oxygen debt. That is, you're trying to break down the accumulated acid that is in your muscles as a result of anaerobic respiration by the muscles. Oh, how does this amount change during and during and after exercise? Actually, during exercise, the lactic acid produced is very high, but immediately you sit down and take those very deep breaths, it radically reduces, it rapidly reduces to minimal amounts because of the increased oxygen amounts in your body that enable to break down the lactic acid. We have looked at anaerobic respiration in plants, in animals, and now we're going to look at anaerobic respiration in yeast. In yeast also, glucose is broken down in absence of oxygen to form ethanol, and that process is known as fermentation. So we have fermentation. Fermentation is the same as for plants, and it is same equation. However, human beings for thousands of years now, more than 5,000 years now, have made good use of this fermentation, this anaerobic respiration, to their advantage. And so, let us look at how we can put to use fermentation in yeast to our advantage. And that is the application. Can use this fermentation in breweries to produce beers, wines, whiskeys, which are the alcoholic brand, produce alcohol using yeast. But we can also use it in bakery. At least you have seen baker's yeast, I suppose, in at least a kitchen or in a magazine or on TV or somewhere. Now, that baker's yeast has yeast in it. So what do? they put that yeast in dough that has been kneaded so that it feeds on that dough. Now, as it feeds on the dough, produces ethanol and carbon dioxide. Now, the carbon dioxide causes those spaces within the bread or whatever it is. Actually, unleavened bread does not have those that spongy feel to it, because there wasn't carbon dioxide produced to cause the sponginess, to cause the increase in the size, the rise in the dough. So yeast is used in bakeries to raise